I enjoyed being home alone a lot as a kid. I never gave my parents a reason not to trust me, so they figured leaving me home alone once in a while wouldn't be a bad idea. On this particular day, I was extra excited to be home alone because I'd be given pizza money and I'd be home alone long enough to enjoy my new video game. My mom was hesitant to leave me alone, but I assured her I'd be fine. She should have listened to her gut. I was halfway through my pizza and just started my game when I heard a car pulling into the driveway. I put my half-eaten slice down and moped over to the window, thinking how I wouldn't get enough time to enjoy my alone time or play my new video game since my parents returned early. It struck me as odd, but I didn't recognize the car in the driveway. I walked over to my front door and opened it. I was met with this massive man, stocky, looked like he worked in construction. "Are your parents home?" "No, sir, I'm home alone." He gave me a chilling smile, and I knew at that point I made a huge mistake. He asked me if he could come in and run some tests. I told him I wasn't allowed to let anyone in while my parents were away. He ignored me and put one of his huge hands on my shoulder, ushering me to the side, and stepped into my house. He looked around and said he had gathered everything he needed. He turned to leave, but paused and turned around again and knelt down to my level. "You shouldn't let strangers walk into your home, kid." He gave me that same bone-chilling smile from earlier and turned around and walked to his car. I shut the door, but not closed completely. I cracked open the door and I saw the man was standing by his car talking to someone on his cell phone. I couldn't make out entirely what he was saying, but I could only hear a few words here and there. I did manage to catch a couple of words. It made my blood run cold. The words were, "Tonight, no witnesses." The man hung up the phone and got into his car. He drove off, but not without getting one last look at my house. I was terrified, but didn't want to bother my parents. If I tell them what happened, they would never trust me to be home alone again. I decided to keep this to myself. I figured, he's a big man, he could have easily shoved me away and ransacked the place. He obviously said what he said to scare me, right? A few hours had passed and I didn't hear any commotion or noise. At that point, I started to forget all about it. It was about 11 p.m. and my parents still weren't home. I didn't bother to call and ask them where they were. I figured, more playing time for me. The house was entirely dark, except for the glow of the TV in my room that could be seen through my window since I always kept my blinds up for some reason. I began to hear noises coming from right in front of my house. I shook it off, not thinking twice. Then I began to hear a constant sound, like someone was throwing rocks at my window. I got up from my gaming chair and turned off my TV. I must admit, I was terrified because the rocks kept getting thrown repeatedly. I walked over to the window and see the silhouette of two men. I took a step back and almost collapsed in terror. The man had returned, but this time not alone. They knew I was home. I began to hear 3 really loud knocks coming from the front door. They would stop for about 2 seconds between each set of knocks. The knocks grew to full-on pounding on my door, to eventually my door being kicked in. I ran to my closet and hid. I dialed 911 from my cell phone, and in a whispered but petrified tone, I gave the operator my address and told her that 2 men had broken into my home. She instructed me to stay hidden and to grab something to use as a weapon. I grabbed a baseball bat and gripped it tightly. I heard footsteps coming up the stairs in the direction of my room. Shakily, I told the operator, and she instructed me not to speak, but to stay on the phone with her. The footsteps stopped at my bedroom door. I was startled and jumped when I heard 3 very soft knocks, followed by the doorknob being turned. Luckily, I had the habit of locking my door. I heard a familiar voice. The same man from earlier was instructing me to open the door and show him where my parents kept their possessions. His accomplice told him to stop playing games and break the door down. He reminded him that they were short on time and they needed to find me before they left. He also said that he couldn't afford another strike. There would have to be no witnesses. My heart began to beat louder and louder, and I began to hyperventilate. I remember fearing I would begin to breathe so loud that the men would easily find me. Then one of the men began to bash a shoulder into the door, and I completely lost it. The operator told me she could hear everything, and she tried to calm me down and assure me that police were only a block away. I could hear the wood from the door begin to splinter until it completely broke. The men entered my room and demanded I come out. I was shaking. They knew I was in here. The men were only in my room for approximately 5 seconds, but it felt like hours in my terrified state. I felt the biggest relief when I heard the sirens approaching my house. The men cursed under their breath and ran out of my room and out of my house. They were caught running through the backyard. My parents were called and I was glad to be back in their presence. The police lectured my parents about leaving me home alone. That was the end of me staying home alone again. I had to get a sitter, and when my parents went out, they weren't gone as long now, 3 hours max. I'm 17 now and I'm finally able to be on my own again. This is just a grim reminder of how awful some people really are. My parents finally trusted me to walk home alone from school. We lived only about an 8 to 10 minute walk away from school, and my parents figured I was mature enough to handle walking home alone. I began to trek back to my house. I was shaking. It was mid-November, right before Thanksgiving, and it was freezing out. A combination of the cold weather and the nerves from walking alone for the first time was too much for my young self. I passed by a truck, looked to be about maybe mid-80s Dodge Ram in really good condition. I was admiring the truck as I walked by. I looked up and was startled to see a man sitting in the driver's seat. I perched up a bit in shock and hurried along. The man looked at me like a lion looks at its prey. I felt such a deep fear. Even at 7 years old, I knew this man meant harm. I began to walk past the truck, and I was about 30 feet away at this point and let out a slight sigh of relief. My hands were cold and clammy. I was a very anxious kid and didn't like interacting with people I didn't know. I heard the distant roar of a truck engine start. I looked back, and it was the Dodge Ram. I began to walk quicker, hoping I'd get home that much faster. The tires of the truck began to roll quietly, as to keep pace, but I ignored it and kept walking. To my shock, I looked to my right and was met with the truck matching my pace. The roads were empty this day for some reason, and he was the first person I'd seen since leaving my school. I heard the window roll down, followed by a deep raspy voice asking me if I needed a ride. I looked over at him and nervously and shakily shook my head. No. He insisted he give me a ride since it was getting colder out and he wanted to make sure I kept warm. I told him I was close enough to my house and didn't need a ride. He then offered to show me around his truck if I'd let him give me a ride home. As politely as I could, I said no again and began to walk away. He began to follow me again and kept offering to give me a ride and insisting the engine sounded better sitting inside of his truck. I began to get frustrated, admittedly hiding my fear behind frustration, and yelled, "No, leave me alone." I began to run in the direction of my house, and the man began to curse at me and yelled at me to get into his truck. He followed me in his truck right up until I got home. Only problem was, my house was on the opposite side of the road, and I would have to come in contact with the truck in order to get home. I made eye contact with the man, and he gave me this chilling grin. He began to open the door to his truck. I panicked and began to scream in terror as loud as my young lungs could. By a stroke of luck, my dad was opening the door to the garage and ran out when he heard the screams. The man saw my dad approach his truck and peeled out of there. My dad ran to comfort me and make sure I was safe. My dad didn't get the man's plate number, and even if we reported it, there was nothing police could do. My parents decided against me walking home alone again. They would be driving me to and from school from now on. Growing up, I had two best friends, AJ and Alex. We did everything together and would have regular sleepovers at each other's houses. We would alternate weekly, and this week was AJ's turn. It was Friday, and like always, we met up in the cafeteria at school for breakfast. We sat at our usual table and ate. Alex brought up what plans we had for the sleepover, but AJ, who was usually the more excited one, didn't reply. Instead, he sat still, looking down at his pancakes. We asked him what was wrong, and he said that he was excited to have us over, but he would be having family over as well. AJ's grandma and aunt would be staying with them until they could figure out living arrangements. We told him it wasn't an issue, but he paused and looked up at us. He mentioned that his aunt isn't all the way there, and she can get crazy and violent when she doesn't take her medication. It was a bit shocking to hear that, honestly, but we assured him everything would be fine. School ended, and the bus dropped us off at AJ's house. We walk in and are immediately greeted by AJ's parents and grandma. His grandma was very kind, but his aunt didn't greet us at all. She just stood there and stared at us. We were walking towards AJ's room when she suddenly put her arm out in front of me as to stop me. I was confused. I looked over at her and she had this stern, angry look on her face. She told me to keep the noise level down and not break anything. AJ's parents told us to run along and have fun. During our time there, we would constantly be met with the angry glare and stern face of his aunt. She looked evil, honestly, and always seemed furious if we made a little extra noise. At one point, we were watching some funny video online, and I'm guessing we were laughing too loud for her liking. I could hear her storming over towards the direction of AJ's room. She barged into the room and gave us that same awful glare and told us to be quiet. She was starting to make Alex and I uncomfortable, but we didn't say anything to AJ. We didn't want to make him feel bad or feel like we wanted to leave, even though I wanted to badly. Unfortunately, this isn't the worst part of it all. That night, we were all sleeping in AJ's room. His room is really big. He has a lot of extra floor space. AJ slept in his bed, and Alex and I slept on the floor. I was awoken in the middle of the night by the sound of the creaking of the door. I looked over and could see the shadow of a person. They were looking into our room. I was hoping it was AJ's parents checking on us, but I swore I could hear a voice. It was AJ's aunt. She had the door cracked open and she was peering into the room. She was whispering something under her breath. I couldn't make out what she was saying. I closed my eyes, pretending to be asleep. I wanted her to walk away so badly. I must have drifted off to sleep at some point, but I was awoken once again. I heard screaming. Into my horror, I look over and see Alex. He's bleeding from his leg. I look up and see AJ's aunt standing over him, wielding a bloodied kitchen knife. AJ woke up too and pleaded with his aunt to put the knife down. I was too scared to say anything. Alex was screaming in pain and crying hysterically. There was blood all over the floor. AJ's aunt stood over us yelling, "Sons of Satan, and they must die." It was a traumatizing and chaotic scene. AJ's parents ran into the room and wrestled the knife away from her. The police were called and took AJ's aunt away. Alex was rushed to the hospital. He suffered 2 lacerations and a small puncture wound to his calf. Luckily, he went on to make a full recovery, physically. This event took a toll on Alex and I mentally. Alex and I started to slowly distance ourselves from AJ. This event ruined our friendship. I still see AJ and his family around town, and Alex and I are still best friends to this day. AJ's aunt was placed in a mental hospital. It turns out she's a paranoid schizophrenic and wasn't taking her medication. I still wake up in the middle of the night, fearing she's standing over me, watching me as I sleep.